Okay, just wanted to get on here real quick to really just to outline an idea, but I will refer to this as Pod11, I guess. But this is sort of a book idea that I've had for a while, and unfortunately at the moment I can't find my written descriptions of the thesis, etc. I knew I wrote something along those lines at some point, but I can't appear to find it at this current time, so I'm going to have to reconstruct it, which is never my favorite thing because I think the ideas are best made and produced organically at the time and not trying to replicate an idea that you already had. But that notwithstanding, I do have a good amount of the ideas in mind and a good amount of written material to go over, just as far as the Iliad and the Odyssey are concerned. But what I'm interested in doing is doing a both quantitative and qualitative analysis of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, in order to analyze in particular the character of Odysseus, how it occurs over the first book of the Iliad, and then the second book, which is the Odyssey. The Odyssey clearly being the story of Odysseus, but the Iliad also being a story of Odysseus to a large extent, even though he's not necessarily the main character. He's clearly one of the main characters driving the plot, present in a lot of circumstances, does a lot of things, and as an interesting character. I think my interest in this stems largely from my interest from a scholarly perspective in Plato. So I may even make a series of at some point to just go over some philosophy-based lectures based on the material from Plato, and just go over it sort of comprehensively as far as what I understand of it and certain interesting issues in the field. And I'm not talking about the field as far as a scholarly field, but sort of my field of interest, which is especially Plato's sort of relation to the religion of his time, and arguably works like the Theogony from Hesiod and Homer's works did a lot to shape the religious ideologies of the time, although whether you can call those truly religious texts, just like making them an analog to the modern Bible, Quran, etc., is not necessarily a one-to-one comparison that's good to make, but it's certainly sacred scripture in some sense, and so it's interesting to evaluate, because when you look at Odysseus, I think you get an interesting look into the sort of psyche of Greek society, sort of writ large, especially as it was sort of expressed when essentially the Athenians, for their Pan-Athenian festivals, were beginning to write down Homer for the first time in order to get it really on wax, and so they arguably shape the viewing of Greek society, but clearly the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey are stories that go well beyond a world that's simply dominated by Athens and Sparta, and so it's clearly a look back into a previous era, arguably either the Mycenaean era or the even potentially into the Minoan era, but unlikely. It's much more a depiction of the Mycenaean era and potentially the period before the sort of 1176 collapse of the Near Eastern civilizations. But that's starting to get a bit afield for what I'm doing here, but what's important just for understanding the ideas, understanding Plato's relation to his religion, as far as I don't think it necessarily made him a heretic, but on the other hand, you've had people like Socrates who were explicitly indicted, prosecuted for having certain religious beliefs, whether or not those religious beliefs were accurately attributed to him or whether they were the misunderstandings of the prosecutors thinking that he preached naturalist phenomenology sort of things about the sun and moon, etc. That's not particularly important, but what I think is important is just that in Plato's work he gives a certain rejoinder, I think, to a lot of traditional Greek ideas, and I think a lot of them do come from the ethos shaped by a culture that was really heavily shaped by Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And so I'm interested to look through, because even the other day when I was poking through the End of the Republic, you see Plato mentioning that at the end of his Myth of Eris story, essentially Odysseus is like the last person who chooses his new soul location, just chooses somebody completely out of nowhere, out in the middle of nowhere, is never going to be a bother to anybody sort of thing, and basically just gets to live in peace. And it's an interesting depiction, but I honestly detect a good amount of hostility in Homer to the character of Odysseus, and I think a lot of Platonic philosophy can be interpreted as a sort of rejection of a society shaped by a certain Odyssean ideology. You could look at that as like a slightly of an analog to like a Machiavellian style thinking, and the term Machiavellian being sort of the commonplace misunderstanding of Machiavelli that is relating to the popular understandings of his work. Is it better to be hated than or feared than loved, yada yada whatever. But that all notwithstanding, Plato has an interesting relation to his religious context, because arguably he wants to get rid of a lot of poetry, banish poets from his ideal society, this, that, and the other. And so it's interesting to evaluate Plato's relation to the epic poetry that he would have arguably been familiar with, Socrates would have been familiar with. And I think the starting place for that is not even in Plato himself. I can get there at some point. Like I said, I may do a series just about Plato himself and then go through Plato's sort of work and have a bit of an emphasis on the religious elements, especially the sort of counterculture, what I think are countercultural and ultimately pushing towards a version of religious ideology. I think is much more along the lines of a monotheistic style of thinking without really logically concluding a lot of his ideas, because a lot of them are put in the form of dialectic, so they're really raised as questions rather than him truly asserting strongly held opinions on X, Y, Z. So it's not so strongly and set in stone sort of stated within that work. So that's interesting, just because I took a class a few years ago at Harvard Extension School on the Greek classics, and learned about the ancient Greek hero, and obviously read Homer, Iliad and Odyssey. Very interesting, and from that class got to gain a really in-depth understanding of both texts, and was interested to go over them for sort of research reasons anyway. But I think the main sort of research interest that I have at this point for going through the text of the Odyssey and the Iliad is really to examine, like I said, quantitatively and qualitatively the character of Odysseus, and doing a bit of a character study on him for the purpose of answering a certain question, which I think was posed in that Harvard Extension class, where the question was essentially, Odysseus described in the Odyssey as veering. So if he's veering, then why does he veer? It's sort of it's an interesting sort of depiction and phrasing of how the Odyssey starts, and this book actually uses the word wander, but veer, I guess in the class, was looked at as a more sort of a more direct translation. And the question is, why did Odysseus veer? And so let me maybe just identify what that even refers to and means, because that may be unclear if you're not familiar with the Iliad and Odyssey. So maybe let me start at the beginning. So the Iliad and the Odyssey are two epic works of poetry by supposedly blind playwright named Homer, and he wrote these sometime during the Greek Dark Ages, so 9 to 700 BC-ish, wrote these works allegedly about sort of the societies prior to the Mycenaean age collapse, although it's not really clear how aware people like Homer were of the collapse of that. Who knows what they were aware of, honestly, in terms of that history. They seem a bit confused, but there's this depiction which is culturally significant of essentially a Greek armada of thousands of ships sailing from various places in Greece as part of a coalition of sorts under a supreme commander of the Allies, Agamemnon, leading troops on behalf of his aggrieved brother Menelaus, Menelaus, king of Sparta, who basically either his wife was stolen in terms of kidnapping, or she absconded of her own free will, unclear, with Paris, aka Alexandros of Troy, which is a major city-state in the Anatolian region of modern-day Turkey, and at the time is depicted to have been at the focal point of sort of a regional alliance where they have other people there, like Aphrodite's son Aeneas. I was blanking on his name first, but I forget what the Dodarians or Dondari, whatever they're friggin' called, the Aeneas's people, that they come to Troy to aid them against the Greeks, and it's all because this dude Alexandros stole Helen, most beautiful woman in the world, blah blah blah. Whole situation of Odysseus essentially tying the Greek world in knots by suggesting to Helen's father how he could creatively resolve the dispute over her betrothal, get her to betroth herself to Menelaus, secure Odysseus's connection to Penelope, yada yada yada. That's not worth getting into right here and now, because again, that's part of the quantitative and qualitative analysis of Odysseus, but again, framing the broader context. So what you have is the broader Greek world, and they're led by, like I said, Agamemnon, who is the king of Mycenae, which is on the eastern coast of the Peloponnese, sort of right in the middle of Greece, where you'd kind of think that the king of Greece would live if you looked at it on a certain sort of map. And as according to the story, he's not the king of anything other than Mycenae, so he's not the king of Greece writ large. He simply has alliances based on him being the supreme Greek monarch, which doesn't mean that he can rule in other people's territories, but he can essentially invoke people via alliances he can invoke their aid and have them come help him. So an example is Odysseus, where Odysseus rules Ithaca and Kephallonia, so he basically rules a set of islands in sort of northwestern Greece, somewhat far away from things, but even for him, the stories of the sort of narrative of what they're going to get Odysseus for portrays it as Odysseus essentially is viewed as a key component of the war by whoever are the people involved, and his rival, Odysseus's rival, who Palamedes, is allegedly one of the ones who helped sort of discover that Odysseus was basically pretending to be mad to skip out on a military expedition that he didn't want to be a part of. But once again, he sort of sealed his own fate on that one by doing the maneuver he did to get himself enmesh himself with Penelope, which, intelligent though the move was, certainly locked him into a set of alliances that essentially, once they discover he's not insane, then at that point he's going with them. And so you could argue, why does Odysseus veer? Well, because he's clever, because he's a man, he's polytropos. He does many things. He's many-sided, and he's clever. And I think this is a sort of character, the sort of clever character is one that I think the Greeks idolize, and you look like a Thrasymachus sort of character in Odyssey, in Plato rather. And I think that he's like a clumsy sort of attempt to institute a sort of truly ruthless, only pragmatic version of Odyssean style thinking, where you do and say whatever it takes in whatever circumstance imaginable in order to achieve the best outcome, ultimately for yourself, not even for the people around you or anything like that. Ultimately, your view is to yourself and not to others. But that notwithstanding, because that is starting to get a little bit into being kind of judgy from my perspective, which isn't really necessary for here. But what is interesting is that he's described in the Odyssey as a veering character, and the question is, why does he veer? And I think there's something to be sort of not taken lightly that I want to go over here, that I think is important, that you don't often hear in the popular depictions of things. I've never seen it in any of the depictions of these things in popular media, but something that I just think is super important. So just looking at the introduction of the Odyssey, which this is the Penguin Classics edition, and so this is the Odyssey in temporal sequence, and this is part 7 of that. So actually I'll read part 6. Odysseus' various adventures in Troy. Other heroes are killed. Troy falls to Odysseus' wooden horse trick. So again, that is what I'm mostly referring to, is the Greeks sort of idolizing this Trojan horse trick of Odysseus, and basically being like, you say do whatever it takes, no matter how honorable, dishonorable it is. Ultimately, for Odysseus, it's all about getting home. He doesn't care, frankly, about winning the war necessarily. He cares about going home without, either the shame of defeat or somebody like Agamemnon going to pursue him. He wants to be able to have his nostos in peace. So again, that's sort of the Trojan War in brief. And then part 7, the Greeks depart for home. Various adventures befall them. In particular, Nestor, king of Pylos, arrives home safely and soon. Lesser Ajax is drowned, presumably for a seizure, rape of Cassandra at Athene's shrine in Troy, though Homer never mentions it. Menelaus, husband of Helen, has adventures at sea for 8 years, especially in Egypt. Agamemnon, leader of the expedition, arrives home in Argos to be killed by Aegisthus, lover of his wife Clytemnestra. His death is avenged by his son Orestes 8 years later, and that's the whole story of the Oresteia. And then Odysseus has one false start leaving Troy before he eventually sets off. We're going to get back to that because that's the important part. I'm going to repeat that sentence. Odysseus has one false start leaving Troy before he eventually sets off. Short story. I'm gonna emphasize that and say that's not a false start. It's one of the key events. But anyway, and then just another one. For 3 years, he's blown around the Mediterranean, experiencing adventures with the Heightens, the Lotus Eaters, and the Cyclops, Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, whom he blinds, etc. And he has more adventures after that. His time with Calypso, etc. Here it actually says that the Calypso thing is essentially just inserted into the story to age Telemachus up to the point of being 20 years old. But I'm starting to get farther afield, so let's go back to sort of my thesis, and I have it written here next to this in an annotation. But so my thesis is I believe that Odysseus' quote-unquote false start leaving Troy before he eventually sets off is way more crucial and worthy of focus than for us to refer to it as a false start. He chose to go back from Tenedos, the island of Apollo. And what I mean by this, and this is something, it's really interesting how it happens in the Odyssey, because the Odyssey doesn't just start in the middle of the story where Odysseus is just, banging around wherever. It actually starts with people essentially are looking for him. But to describe his false start without going right to the page immediately, because I have more annotations on the Iliad at this point than the Odyssey, but just to speak on it from memory, what essentially happens is, so the Greeks they've won. They've taken Troy, they've sacked the city, they've done this, they've done that. They've committed all their crimes. And so they're there, they're back on the beach by their ships, and, presumably they're going to leave. But what ends up happening is that there's a dispute. And there's a dispute between the sons of Atreus, essentially. So Agamemnon and Menelaus have an argument where what they're arguing about is Menelaus wants to offer a whole bunch of sacrifices and this, that, or no. Back up. Agamemnon wants to offer a bunch of sacrifices of bulls, this, that, and the other. He's sacrificing animals, essentially. He wants to do this big religious ritual before they leave Troy for good. Menelaus is not about that. Menelaus argues with him and basically says that he wants to leave immediately. He doesn't want to delay at all. He wants out. And so they have a bit of a dispute where, and I'm gonna find this actually in Odyssey, book 3, so give me a second here. Alright, here we go. Finally found the paragraph. So this is, so put this in context. This is the character Nestor, who, if you're not familiar with Homer, he's essentially Grandpa Simpson with the Greek army. He's telling stories left, right, and center about the good old days, and he was buddies with one of the great ancient Greek heroes whose name escapes me and literally the greatest of the Greek heroes, and I'm forgetting him, but it doesn't even matter because Nestor is who he is. But all right, sorry for the pause on that one. I just got mildly interrupted, but anyway, so we're here and we're at line 130 in book 3 of the Odyssey. And again, Nestor is essentially Grandpa Simpson of Homer. And so he says, after we destroyed Priam's towering city, we left in our ships But then the gods scattered the fleet. Zeus planned disaster for our homeward journey because we had not all behaved sensibly and honestly, and many came to grief through the fatal anger of the bright-eyed daughter of that mighty sire. It happened like this. She began making the two sons of Atreus quarrel. Acting on the spur of the moment and with no regard for procedure, they summoned the whole Achaean army to assemble at sunset so that the troops arrived drunk, told them the reason for their assembly. Menelaus put it to them all that their first concern should be to get to their distant homes across the sea. This was not at all to Agamemnon's liking. He was for keeping them there and making ceremonial offerings to Athena in the hope of appeasing her terrible wrath, not realizing in his folly how implacable she would prove, for it is not so easy to divert the immortal gods from their purpose. Well, the pair of them stood there exchanging hard words till the soldiers, themselves divided in opinion, broke up the assembly in indescribable uproar. That night we rested, nursing vindictive feelings against our comrades in arms, for Zeus was making ready to strike the fatal blow. In the morning, half of us ran our ships down into the tranquil sea, stowed in them our spoils and the captive women in their low-girdled dresses. Then, though the rest still held back, stayed where they were with Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, our party embarked and set out. Our ship sailed fast, for God had leveled the deep swell of the sea. Soon reached Tenedos, and there, eager to be home, we sacrificed the gods. Zeus had no intention of letting us reach home so soon. He mercilessly stirred dissension among us once more. As a result, one squadron swung the curved prows of their vessels round, turned back to Troy. These were the followers of Odysseus, that wise and subtle king, falling in once more with the wishes of Agamemnon, son of Atreus. But I, well aware of the gods' sinister designs, fled with the massed ships that formed my company. Warlike Diomedes did the same, bringing his party with him, and later on, auburn-haired Menelaus followed too. He caught us up at Lesbos, where we were pondering over the long sea journey, whether to sail north of the rugged coast of Chios and by way of Syria, however that's pronounced, keeping that island to our left, or to sail south of Chios, past the windy heights of Mimas. We prayed for a sign, and the god made it clear that we should cut straight across the open sea to Euboea to get out of harm's way as quickly as possible. Whistling wind blew up, and our ships made splendid running down the teeming seaways, reaching Gerastus during the night. Many a bull's thigh we laid on Poseidon's altar after spanning that weary stretch of water. It was on the fourth day that the company of Diomedes, son of Tydeus, tamer of horses, brought their fine craft anchor in Argos, but I held on for Pylos, and the breeze never dropped from the moment when the god made it blow. Consequently, dear child, I got back without any news of the men we had left behind, and no idea who escaped or who was lost. So then Nestor starts going on to tell Telemachus about everybody except Odysseus, and then eventually gets to him and gives him a little bit of information. To just go through this sort of summary here real quick. Telemachus visits Nestor. First he hears stories of other Greeks' returns, nothing of Odysseus. Accompanied now not by Athena, but by Nestor's son Pisistratus, he moves on to Sparta. Oh, that's how it works. Yeah, and then he goes to Sparta, and Menelaus and his wife are essentially tripping out on drugs all the time to deal with their trauma, and he gives them more information about Odysseus, that he is alive, etc. But he doesn't quite know, and I think he sends him off somewhere else to learn more stuff. I'll go over that at some point because that's going to be part of the whole analysis of it. But I just think it's interesting to circle back on this point. Odysseus had one false start, leaving Troy before he eventually sets off. So then again, if we look at in detail what Nestor says and take it for granted that Nestor is a bit of a storyteller. This guy was the friend of, I cannot remember. Heracles. Yeah, he was Heracles' friend. I mean, goodness gracious, how did I not remember that name? But he's a bit of an old dude, but he's viewed as wise, and for some reason he's part of the story. So, he's got the gods all over the place in his reasoning. The gods scattered the fleet. Zeus planned disaster. Athena was involved. She makes the Agamemnon and Menelaus fight, etc., etc. They assemble the army. They argue, etc. And then Zeus. So what's interesting in Homer is everything is fundamentally the will of Zeus, even though all sorts of things happen against the will of Zeus, like when Hera wears a Aphrodite's belt and seduces Zeus and basically puts him to sleep while she intervenes in the Trojan War, and all these other things that don't appear to be the will of Zeus. But that's sort of the contradiction of Greek religion, is that everything is the will of Zeus and isn't the will of Zeus. It's kind of perfect for religion, actually. It's the explanation to everything and nothing at the exact same time. But in essence, what's going on here is that what Nestor is depicting, though, is that the Greeks essentially had a choice right after they won their war. Their choice was, you can either go home right now and get going, get on your way, or you're gonna face some consequences, because what happened to Agamemnon, even though he did return home safely at first, clearly the Orestia, if you ever read it, the Oresteia, and these are the other works in that sort of trilogy, clearly things don't quite go right for Agamemnon, and they really don't go right for anybody seemingly who decides to side with Agamemnon on the issue against Menelaus of whether they should leave immediately or after a sacrifice. And you analyze that depiction of that scene, and I think what you would say to Agamemnon if he wouldn't essentially kill you for saying this in front of other people was, and you basically have to be like his priest Calchas and have some sort of diplomatic immunity sort of situation to be able to stand in front of the king and be like, yeah, it's actually your fault, buddy, but I think it's pretty clear that there was no amount of sacrificing that was gonna atone for what had happened in the entirety of the events, especially in the sack of the city. And so I think what this implies, what Homer is implying here, is that that Menelaus essentially had the right of the argument because he knew to just get his things and get going, and he will be delayed for 8 years. So a little bit like Odysseus, in the sense that Odysseus is away from home for 20 years, and that means that Menelaus is away from home for 18. He gets trapped in Egypt, a bunch of other silly shit. He basically has his own mini Odyssey, but he eventually does get home. And again, everybody seemingly who leaves with the Menelaus faction of this issue, they all return home safely and mostly on time. Diomedes gets home first because he's first destination, he's first stop on the bus, and then and then Nestor also gets home. Agamemnon gets home as well, because he's got a relatively close trip as well, and then Odysseus would probably have the longest trip of anybody, so you would expect his trip to be longer, but you would have expected if he had left with this initial group with Menelaus and had completed that journey, that he arguably doesn't have his Odyssey. So why does Odysseus veer? Well, I think he veers because, in particular, he turns back at Tenedos, and that's important context. I'm just going to throw that out there. I'll explain more what Tenedos is and the connection to Apollo. But my general argument is that Apollo is fundamentally the person responsible for Odysseus's delay, along with other factors, because Nestor here is attributing things to Zeus and Athena, and what he's saying is essentially that the Greeks committed a bunch of crimes in the city of Troy. In particular, certain people were defiled and killed and sexually assaulted in the sanctuary of Athena, or her temple, or at her altar, something along those lines. So she's unhappy with them after, helping them win the war. But then you read the Odyssey, and it's pretty clear that Odysseus is one of Athena's favorites. He may not be her number one favorite, which isn't even necessarily a relevant designation, because I would argue that's that Diomedes really is that, and based on his depiction in book 5 of the Iliad. But Athena certainly is a patron of Odysseus to some extent, and so we can't just take Nestor's opinion that it was because of Athena that Odysseus was so delayed. I think the more logical candidates are either Zeus or Apollo, but more likely Apollo, because again, Zeus doesn't really do anything. He's just kind of there to pull against the other forces that be, and to be the kind of authority figure that they sort of rebel against. So I don't think that Zeus was punishing Odysseus for doing what he did. I do think that Apollo was, though, and I can get into the sort of the detailing of that, and that again, that kind of takes me back to where I was going to go with this, which is kind of an analysis of book 1 of the Iliad, and I might not go over the whole thing, because to go over the whole of book 1 would be a long time, but just to go over the beginning of the Iliad also will be good to give a little bit of the formatting of how Homer tends to write, and therefore understanding the story sort of along the lines of how I learned about it in the ancient Greek hero class. But so there's sort of this initial paragraph where it's and in English it goes, anger, seeing goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that accursed anger which brought the Greeks endless suffering, sent the mighty souls of many warriors down to Hades, leaving their bodies as carrion for the dogs and a feast for the birds. Zeus's purpose was fulfilled. All began when Agamemnon, lord of men, and godlike Achilles quarreled and parted. So there's always this intro paragraph where the muse will sing, and they will start with a word. So in the Iliad, the word is anger, or rage. So the rage of Achilles, and that's mentis, I think, and so they're singing about that, and that is sort of the emphasis of the Iliad. So that's why Iliad compared to the Odyssey, the Iliad is much more a war hero, warrior culture sort of book, where the Odyssey is more of an adventurer sort of book. It's about the veering and the polytropous nature of Odysseus, which I will get into that more, but even here in this initial paragraph, again, we've got the depiction of Zeus's purpose, which is sort of important for the work of Homer. You've got the involvement of the muses singing a story. They're singing of the rage of Achilles, son of Peleus, and then describing how it caused a lot of people to die, and pinpointing the start of the anger at the point of their quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles. But then, right then after that, in the paragraph, it all began when Agamemnon, lord of men, and godlike Achilles quarreled and parted. Which of the gods was it that made them quarrel? It was Apollo, son of Zeus and Leto, who started the feud because he was furious with Agamemnon for not respecting his peace Chryses. So Apollo inflicted a deadly plague on Agamemnon's army and destroyed his men. So I could go through sort of this scene here, but what's important is that Chryses is Apollo's priest, and so actually, let me just fucking read this, it doesn't matter. Chryses had come to the Greek swift ships to recover his captured daughter, brought with him an immense ransom, carried the emblems of the archer god, Apollo, and a golden staff in his hands, spoke in supplication to the whole Greek army, most of all to its two commanders, Agamemnon and Menelaus, sons of Atreus. And you, other Greek men at arms, you hope to sack Priam's town and get home in safety. May the gods that live on Olympus grant your wish. Now respect the archer god Apollo, son of Zeus, accept this ransom and release my beloved daughter. So, just a bit of analysis of sort of the Homeric style of this. So, Chryses is bringing a ransom. This happens a lot. There's a lot of ransoming. He's got emblems of the archer god, and he's got a staff in his hand, so he has symbols of authority, but he speaks in supplication. So basically, what Homer is getting to here is that the religious man didn't just march into the army's camp and start demanding the return of his daughter and all this. He frankly comes with respect and says that, you're here for a reason, let's go over this, to sack Priam's town and get home in safety. Unfortunately, a lot of people in this scene will not even live to see the sack of Priam's town, and a lot of them also will not get home in safety. And this priest says, may the gods that live on Olympus grant your wish. Now respect the archer god Apollo. So, what's interesting here is this is essentially a depiction of not a Trojan priest, but a priest from a nearby town allied with Troy, which has been sacked at some point, presumably by Achilles himself. And Achilles has taken a bunch of hostages, including some of these highborn women and priestesses. He's taken Briseis for himself, and he's given Chryses to Agamemnon as a bit of a trick, because Briseis is the better one or whatever, but that notwithstanding. I think what's important to note here, we're looking at Nestor talking about the rage of, or not the rage, but the sort of the vengeance of Athena as far as crimes done in her sanctuary being revisited upon the various participants in the sack of Troy. And I don't think Nestor quite has the right read of it, and I think again the beginning of the Iliad here is really a signal forward throughout the work of Homer, that when we talk about which of the gods was it that made them quarrel, which of the gods was it that ultimately, I think, makes Odysseus veer? I think the answer lies with Apollo, because, and again, it says that he started a feud because Agamemnon didn't respect his priest, so he inflicts a deadly plague on the army. And Homer has this weird sort of writing style where he will write little descriptions of what's going to happen and then just write it again and then sometimes repeat himself. So there's a little bit of an aspect to that, but I guess it's part of the poetry aspect of it as well. To read it in ancient Greek would probably be very different. But again, so this priest has come with respect to the kings, and all he wants is his daughter back. Unfortunately, and again, this is why Achilles doesn't get a lot of heat for this, but when he tricks Agamemnon into taking Chryseis, number one, that locks Chryseis into Agamemnon's awful clutches, which isn't ideal, and then it also puts Achilles in the situation where he's eventually gonna, quarrel with Agamemnon, essentially over spoils and being despoiled of his spoils. But anyway, so the priest is asked for his daughter back, who unfortunately the king isn't going to want to let go that easily. But anyway, so going on, Homer, then all the other Greeks shout in agreement. They wanted to see the priest respect in the splendid ransom taken. This was not at all to Agamemnon's liking. He cruelly and bluntly dismissed the priest. So I could go on to read this whole thing, but long story short, Agamemnon scares the shit out of this dude and sends him away. He says, now get out and don't provoke me if you want to save your skin. So he's pissed off, and who knows exactly why Agamemnon is such a essentially Agamemnon is saying a bunch of ironic stuff that is not going to come true about her. Cassandra growing old in Argos in my household, a long way from her country, working at the loom, sharing my bed. Oh yeah. Yeah, at one point Agamemnon basically says, that's a nice stick you have. You might find it to be a little defense against me. Don't let me catch you loitering around our ships or coming back again. And so the priest goes away, and he's afraid, and he doesn't say anything back to Agamemnon. He just bounces. But then when he walks away, so he pours out prayers to Lord Apollo, son of lovely-haired Leto. Hear me, Apollo, Lord of the silver bow, protector of Chrysae and holy Scylla, mighty ruler over Tenedos. Let me do that again. Mighty ruler over Tenedos, that is Apollo. Play God, if I ever built you a temple that pleased you, if I ever burnt you offerings of fat thighs of bulls or goats, grant me this wish. Make the Greeks pay with your arrows for my tears. So, I have a little annotation here which says, Apollo is many things, including the ruler over Tenedos. So, I want to kind of circle back to this because Odysseus turns back at Tenedos, and that's what delays his Nostos. And so I think this priest is kind of getting all that he asked for with this sort of prayer right here. And I don't think you can say that this is the point where Odysseus has been completely set on his course of veering, but I think that this is sort of a crucial element that doesn't get discussed enough, is the fact that essentially in that book 3 depiction, We soon reached Tenedos. Zeus had no intention of letting us reach home so soon. As a result, one squadron turned around. Those were the followers of Odysseus, following in once more with the wishes of Agamemnon, son of Atreus. And so, what I would argue is that this is the reason fundamentally why Odysseus veers, is because at this crucial moment where he's at Apollo's island, this isn't to say that Apollo doesn't let him go, because it's clearly Odysseus makes his own decision on this matter, but Odysseus clearly decides to go back and get Agamemnon. Now again, based on the depiction in the books, I don't believe that Odysseus believes that Agamemnon is a holy man by any stretch. I don't think that Odysseus is a particularly holy man, even though he is favored by the gods, but he's not like a religious freak, essentially. I don't believe that he would be going back just because of the ritual element. He's going back essentially for political reasons of one kind or the other. But it's essentially unclear in this story, and what I'm interested in doing is doing sort of a full deep dive from both the Iliad and the Odyssey to just go through Odysseus' character, kind of noting every time he's involved in scenes and discussing essentially what these elements sort of indicate. Because again, Odysseus turns back at Tenedos. Apollo is basically the patron god of that island, and so I think there's some symbolic meaning of Odysseus being the one ultimately responsible for the Greeks breaching the walls at Troy, the walls built by Apollo, and then Odysseus being essentially singled out for a particularly long period of veering, etc. I don't think those things are unconnected. I think, it just doesn't seem like a good explanation to just tie everything into the will of Zeus and say that it's all about the will of Zeus, because I think clearly in certain circumstances there are indications that there are other gods who are more relevant to the particular circumstances, and again, I think it's Apollo in this case. And again, why exactly Apollo has a gripe with Odysseus at this point is probably the most unclear part for me, but I think that the connection there shouldn't be understated, because it forms some really relevant context to what eventually happens. And so that's sort of a project I'm interested in sort of exploring in general, again because of the relation between Plato and Homer. I think that Plato is in a lot of ways anti-Homeric in a lot of his ethics, and so I think it's interesting sort of to analyze and discuss the characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey, to see those depictions, to see what is so potentially objectionable, and then further to have the particular emphasis on Odysseus, I think, because I just think in particular that the ethic of Plato, I think, is so clearly anti-Odysseus in sort of orientation that it is worth exploring essentially who the character of Odysseus is, what the circumstances are where we say that he veers, what it means for him to be polytropous, many-sided, many-faced sort of character, a complex character, this, that, and the other. And one thing I will say sort of at the end, again, actually, to sort of correct something I said a minute ago, but I think I might have went like a step too far. I don't think it's necessary to say for Odysseus's turning back at Tenedos, I don't think we need to see that necessarily as Apollo imposing that. So then we could maybe fit that back into the will of Zeus, where the will of Zeus is being exercised more generally speaking, and Apollo's island is just like the stage for a certain decision, etc. But I'm interested to look in sort of the motivations for why Odysseus would have turned back. And according to the Odyssey, what it says is that so falling in once more with the wishes of Agamemnon, son of Atreus, and then Nestor says, I, well aware of the god's sinister designs, fled with the massed ships that formed my company. Warlike Diomedes did the same. Later on, auburn-haired Menelaus followed too. So interesting how Menelaus actually doesn't leave as immediately as he could have, and maybe that's part of why he got delayed, whereas Diomedes and Nestor just get going immediately. But what I think is indicated here by the chain of events that happen to the people who leave immediately and don't turn back is essentially they get home, and I think the reason they get home is the gods were not necessarily going to punish them on their way home, but the people who end up getting punished are kind of the hypocrites who end up turning back for various reasons, whether it's Agamemnon not wanting to leave, trying to make the sacrifices in vain to wash out the stain of everything, whether that's like the implied killing of his daughter, or all these other elements that help to form Agamemnon's character, and etc. But I think that anybody who dared to sort of participate in the sort of folly of what Agamemnon was doing, they share a little bit in his fate, which Agamemnon's fate was worse than, I guess, a lot of people's in a certain way. And so, especially compared to Odysseus and his brother, because Agamemnon dies and they both survive, and they're both alive in the Odyssey. But it certainly looks like Odysseus was essentially punished for turning back at Tenedos. So maybe you could even reinterpret it and say, it was actually a certain lack of faith in maybe in Apollo, but like something to tie it back to Apollo, because I think Apollo is so present all over at various points in the story, whether it's in that first chapter, or whether he's stopping Patroclus at the walls of Troy, because essentially it's not the way the story is supposed to end. Apollo sort of understands that the walls will be destroyed at some point, but I don't think he wants that to happen. I may honestly Alright, so we have flipped ahead quite a bit in the Iliad, so we're in book 16 here, and we're essentially depicting Patroclus trying to assault the walls of Troy. So let's just read this all. But Patroclus, with murder in his heart, leapt on the enemy. 3 times he charged with an intimidating yell. Like impetuous Ares, 3 times he killed 9 men. But when he leapt in something like something superhuman for the 4th time, then Patroclus, the end was in sight. In the heat of the battle, Phoebus encountered you. Phoebus, most terrible. Patroclus had not seen him coming through the mayhem. God had wrapped himself in a thick mist for this meeting. Stood behind Patroclus now, and striking his back and broad shoulders with the flat of his hand, he made Patroclus's eyes spin and knocked the helmet off his head. With its heavy visor it rolled, clattering away under the horse's hooves, and its plume was defiled with blood and dust. It had not been allowed to defile that crested helmet in the dust before. when it protected the head and handsome face of godlike Achilles, but now Zeus granted it to Hector to wear, since he was very close to death. The long, shadowed spear, huge, thick, and heavy with its head of bronze, was shattered in Patroclus' hand. Fringed spear with its strap fell from his shoulder to the ground, and Lord Apollo, son of Zeus, undid the body armor on his chest. A fatal blindness overtook Patroclus. His shining limbs were paralyzed, stood there in a gaze. A Dardanian named Euphorbus, son of Panthus, came up to him at close range, threw a sharp spear, and hit him in the middle of the back between the shoulders. This Euphorbus was the best spearman, runner, and horseman of his years in this very battle. First he fought as a charioteer, learning the art of war. He had already brought 20 men from their chariots to the ground. He was the first then to let it fly at you, charioteer Patroclus, but he didn't kill you. After pulling out the ash spear from his flesh, he ran back and mingled with the crowd. He did not stay to fight Patroclus, defenseless though he was, and now overcome by the god's blow and Euphorbus' spear. Patroclus began to retreat into his own contingent of warriors to avoid death. When Hector saw great-hearted Patroclus wounded in retreat, he made his way towards him, though through the ranks, and coming up stabbed him with his spear in the lower belly, driving the bronze clean through. Patroclus thudded to the ground, throwing the whole Greek army into consternation. As the lion's will to fight overpowers an indomitable wild boar, when the fearless pair battled out in the mountains over a little stream, both wished to drink there, but the lion's strength prevails and his panting enemy is overcome. So after killing many men himself, Meniodas' strong son fell to a close range thrust from Hector, who spoke to him in triumph with winged words. Patroclus, you probably thought you'd sack our town, make Trojan women slaves, and ship them off to the land of your fathers, you innocent. In their defense, Hector's swift horses were racing into battle. I, Hector, finest spearman of the war-loving Trojans, who stand between them and the day of slavery. As for you, vultures are going to eat you on this very spot. Miserable wretch, even great Achilles did not save you. I can imagine all the instructions he gave you on your way out while he stayed behind. Charioteer Patroclus, don't come back to the hollow ships until you have ripped through the tunic on man-slaying Hector's chest and soaked it with blood. That, I imagine, is what he must have said, and like an idiot you took him at his word. Fading fast, you replied, charioteer Patroclus. Hector, boast long and loud while you can. Zeus and Apollo handed you that victory. They conquered me. It was an easy task. They took the armor from my back. If 20 men like you had confronted me, they would have all fallen to my spear. No, it was deadly destiny and Leto's son Apollo that did for me. Then came a man, Euphorbus. You are the third of them all to kill me. But I will tell you something else, and you bear it in mind. You too, I swear it, have not long to live. Already you stand in the shadow of death and inexorable destiny, slaughtered at the hands of Achilles, the matchless son of Peleus. Yeah, so that's a whole depiction, and honestly, this sort of depicts again sort of the centrality of Apollo to these events. Apollo is, if not the cause of these events, he's the sort of the proximate sort of accelerant to a lot of these scenarios and what ends up happening. And so I think that we just have to give a little bit of closer examination when we say Odysseus turned back at Tenedos. He turned back at the island of Apollo. So then, looking through, because Odysseus is the one in book 1 of the Iliad who leads the mission to return Chryseis eventually to from Agamemnon to Chryseis, and he sort of oversees that, and I'm pretty sure that he, let's see, because this might, Alright, so just to read this line real quick, because it's really important to understanding both the Iliad and the Odyssey, but this is from Achilles, and he is praying to his mother, and he says, make wide ruling. Agamemnon, son of Atreus, realized the delusion he is under in giving no respect to the best of all Greeks. And Agamemnon will eventually sort of realize his delusion, however self-interested that realization is. But then when they're returning Chryses to Chryse, it's Odysseus and his crew with the sacred offerings, and they bring the ship there. And then the cattle for archer god Apollo were landed. Chryses stepped ashore from the seafaring vehicle. Quick-thinking Odysseus then led the girl to the altar. They gave her back into her father's arms and said, Chryses, Agamemnon, lord of men, has ordered me to bring you your daughter and to make a sacred offering of oxen to Apollo on the Greeks' behalf in hope of pacifying the god who has been inflicting sorrow and mourning on our men. With these words, he handed over the girl into the arms of her father, who joyfully welcomed his beloved child. Sacred offering of oxen to do honor to the god was quickly set in place round the well-built altar. The men rinsed their hands and took up their sacrificial grains. Then Chryses lifted his hands and prayed aloud, Hear me, Apollo, lord of the silver bow, protector of Chryse and holy Scylla, mighty ruler over Tenedos! ! You heard me when I prayed to you before. You showed your respect for me and struck a great blow at the Greek army. Now grant me a second wish and lift the loathsome plague from the Greeks. So he spoke in prayer, and Phoebus Apollo heard him. When they had made their prayers, thrown the grain over their victims, blah, blah, blah. So they sacrifice, and it's a whole description of the sacrifice. But they basically just have a big feast, and essentially things are resolved, except for Achilles is still sort of pissed off and all by himself. But just based on the quick reading of this scene, a few things come to mind. First of all, thinking about the sacrifice part of it, and I didn't read all the sort of explicit details, but I really read you the Patroclus scene of him getting killed, and that basically is the exact same thing. So, the sacrificial animal is essentially stunned into not being able to feel, and then is killed with a set of blows and drained of blood and all these sort of things that are done, etc. And so, what's interesting is that Patroclus is clearly a sort of therapon, and his sacrifice brings Achilles back into the fight. And so that sacrifice was essentially performed by Apollo himself. And so you could say that Apollo essentially has a more sacred sacrifice because of the way he does it, as opposed to any of these sacrifices that ultimately Agamemnon is responsible for Odysseus bringing a certain sacrifice to this priest of Apollo, and they do the sacrifice, and it appears to work because the sickness disappears from their camp or whatever. But I think you could look at this and say, essentially, why is Odysseus in this scene? Well, Odysseus is just picked because he's one of the sort of the prominent Greeks, and so I think what's important, real quick, without getting into a ton of details, is just it's interesting that Odysseus is essentially involved in this sacrifice with the priest of Apollo for the same reason he's involved with the war, namely just because he's involved. Like, it's not necessarily because he wants to be there, it's just kind of expected of him. It's more of a duty than something he wants to do, and he always seems to carry out his duties in a dutiful way, and I think that should be noted. But, we have here this sort of sacrifice, returning of Chryses and all these sort of things that are ostensibly good, but again, they're trying to make up for an ill that probably can't be made up for, especially as far as the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles is concerned. That's not reconciled at all. And so there's a situation where you could argue that Odysseus was that essentially one criticism you can make of him is that he essentially goes along with things a little too much, to the extent that, even a situation where he's at Tenedos and probably has like Apollo's go ahead to just get on out of here and keep it moving, but Odysseus seems uncertain of things, and so he decides to turn around and go back to Agamemnon, whether it's to help him out or to convince him to leave, whatever. But I just think that is a very important detail point to be considered when looking at the story of Odysseus, his character. And so again, the broader scope of this would be to do a sort of quantitative and qualitative analysis of first the Iliad and then also the Odyssey to get as comprehensive an understanding as possible of Odysseus' character, such that by understanding his character better in a more comprehensive way, we can start to explain questions like, why did Odysseus veer? What took him so long getting home? What was the difference between him and all these other characters? And I would argue it just has to do with his relationship with Apollo, a lot of the things that happen, the sort of nature of his polytropous, sort of many-faced personality. And so I ultimately think that Odysseus is a really interesting character to look at as far as a depiction of a pragmatist, of somebody who does what they have to do in order to survive, and then understanding that Plato had such a critique of that, and his critique is so fundamental to his ethics and sort of the way that he influenced ethics and religion going forward. I just think it's interesting to sort of consider the sort of characters that Plato, in a certain sense, is fighting against, and I think one of them is certainly Odysseus. And so hopefully this was just the first in a longer series where I start to go through certain examples of essentially going through comprehensively, like I said, quantitative and qualitative analysis. So to define that more specifically, I don't just want to offer opinions about, I think that Odysseus did this, this, and that. I really want to base it on the text itself, and that's the quantitative analysis of, when Odysseus is in scenes with other Greek warrior chieftains, he speaks this percentage of the time, or he's involved with proceedings this percentage of the times, and how many times does he actively take measures versus simply sitting there and observing? A scene like him beating the shit out of Thersites, a scene like him running away from son of Tydeus, Diomedes, when Diomedes is in kind of dire straits and needs his help, but then in that moment slightly unheroically, Odysseus sort of ignores him and keeps on running with everybody else and leaves Diomedes to his fate, and then Diomedes gets help from the gods, so arguably didn't need Odysseus's help. But I just think it's an interesting depiction of a hero who doesn't always do what we would think of as a heroic thing in the context of modern society. But then that's to kind of go back to the ancient Greek depiction where referring to somebody as a hero, not necessarily a positive or negative connotation, but just a description of the sort of grand nature of the things that they did. And so there's arguably also sort of a depiction contrast between the character of Odysseus and the character of Achilles. If you look at it, I think Achilles actually is a lot more along the lines of what Plato espouses his philosophy of ethics to be, and therefore it's just interesting that there's supposed to be such a contrast between those two characters. You know, Achilles would have never done the thing that that Odysseus did when he runs away from Diomedes, which again I think is really important. But Achilles would have never done that. He either would have been on the battlefield or not. There wouldn't have been a situation where it was a matter of, oh, well, you know, I didn't know, or I didn't hear this dude when I was running away, etc. It's not my fault. So there's clearly a sort of contrasting hero depiction between, perhaps you could think of it as just like the simpler hero as Achilles, who has kind of simpler, more pure motivations, and then somebody like Odysseus, who's much more multifaceted and complex. And I think those depictions are interesting character-wise, and I think when you're potentially critiquing Plato's ethics, as I might, you want to sort of understand this context of the Achilles Odysseus sort of contrast, the way I think that a lot of Greek people sort of idolize the Odysseus character, and I think it's easier to recognize yourself in Odysseus as a character than it is to recognize yourself in Achilles or Agamemnon or any of these other people. And so but that was meant to be just sort of a first foray into this topic. I have interest too, and like I said, deep dives into Plato's work, also continued presentations on the Iliad and the Odyssey along these lines to do some sort of work. But this was meant to sort of give me to replace sort of the thesis paragraphs that I thought I'd written some time ago but can't apparently find anymore, and start to reconstruct those ideas and start to flesh them out, even to see, for example, that my depiction of, it's like, oh, look at Apollo, becomes more complex, because it's like, well, is Apollo doing something? Is Apollo following instructions from somebody else? What exactly is Apollo doing, and how much is he being essentially puppeteered? So, but that's just where I wanted to start. So I'm going to end here at the end of part 2 of Pod 11. Thanks.